Good morning. I'm the welcome and the warm-up act. So we appreciate that people are traveling from all around the DMV, and we'll be sort of rolling in as we get started. But I'm here to sort of kick things off and set the stage for today's 26th annual Business of Pediatrics. Imagine that. Let's see if I can move these slides. Oh, that's what this is. There we go. All right. Much of this should be on the info sheet that you were handed with the agenda, but the Wi-Fi password to access the Wi-Fi here is BOP 2023. There'll be parking vouchers available at the registration table. Sometimes by the end of the day, the gates are up, but we'll keep you informed as the day plays out. Bathrooms are at the end of the hallways. We will have mid-morning and mid-afternoon breaks and breaks at lunchtime. And if you need any help, we've got a whole team from the Pediatric Health Network. They're out there in these fancy black vests, and we're here to help you have a great day. All right, so hard to believe this is 26 years. Last year when we were back in person doing this, we noticed a lot of folks holding up their iPads and their phones and taking pictures of those sorts of things. You can access today's slides using the QR code on the agenda, so that you're welcome to take notes and you're welcome to take pictures, but we tried to make it easier for folks to sort of follow along. All the presentations will be recorded and available after the presentation on our Pediatric Health Network website, so you'll be able to go back and relive all these magic moments, okay? We will also be making the presentations, the Business of Pediatric presentations, available to your friends, colleagues, and partners who may not be able to attend in person today. We realize that we have busy practices and someone's got to be at the ranch seeing the boys and girls in the practice, but we're thrilled that every year we get a great turnout, and we expect a great turnout today. We will pause during at the end of the presentations for Q&A. Because this is being recorded, we have mics here, and we will have runners to bring the mics to you so that we can try to make sure that we've capturing all these things. CME credit. It's on the back of your agenda. You can either send a text message or scan a QR code and then use the BECJOD activity code to log in and get CME credit for today's presentation. If you do not have a GW University CME account, there's instructions on the back of the agenda as well, and folks out on our team area can help you also. Questions about CME? All right, I think part of that is sort of the basics. Today's program, as it has been over our 26 years, is hosted by our Pediatric Health Network, clinically integrated network of pediatricians and specialists and folks at Children's National. We're here to advance what's now called the quintuple aim: improving the quality of care, improving patient satisfaction, managing costs while demonstrating value, and elevating the provider, your experience and your care team's experience, and increasingly trying to advance health equity. and piece of cake, but actually we're making great strides in this space. Today's meeting is sponsored by Pediatric Health Network. We have no other external sources of funding. The educational programming content is determined by your input and feedback and our board, and we have a planning committee who's been doing this for years and years and years, and we actually think we have a great show today, but give us your feedback. If you want to see more of this or less of that, let us know. It's hard to please 300 people, all exactly the same, but actually I think today will be a really interesting mix. So thank you for your participation and support. I think we hit this CME thing. We do have learning objectives. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but that's part of the CME thing. Part of this is really how to help you all do better clinically, how to help you all do better in running your practices successfully. Running pediatric practices is hard work. And a lot of us learn as we go, but part of today's meeting is bringing together all of us under one roof to share best practices and hear from industry experts about ways to sort of make your practices better, make your care delivery better, make your wellness better, and better serve our patients and families. All our presenters signed disclosures to avoid conflicts of interest. Some of our presenters actually are in the business of providing advice to pediatric practices. This room is all about sharing knowledge. The exhibition hall over there is about supporting practices and helping them out that way. So we are really trying to maintain the appropriate boundaries. This is all about shared learning, and business stuff will be in the exhibition halls. And then our lawyers want me to put this slide in. We're the sponsor, not the last word. We put this together with guidance of industry experts. That's why we bring national and local coding experts and practice management experts here into this auditorium. Always follow CMS and CPT coding guidelines. And just because you play it the right way and do it by the rules doesn't necessarily mean the payers are working with us. So know your payers, watch your claims, watch your payments, challenge appropriately. And part of the reason we're gathering here today is to learn from each other and to share best practices and raise all boats. Our job here is really to try to help all of our pediatric practices in our region learn from each other and be successful. And we want to have fun. And so we'll have one or two little challenging perspectives over the course of today's show. So just a reminder, if you want to be able to see the slides as you go along, you can scan the QR code on the front of the agenda. The back of the agenda is CME, front side is accessing the presentations. And the morning is teed up. Chip Hart will open about looking at getting the data, why you need data and getting the data you need. Jan Blanchard, a coding specialist, will then be providing our 2024 update. There'll be a mid-morning break, and then following the break, Dr. Sandy Chung, who's well known to this audience just from her leadership role with Trusted Pediatrics and practices around the region, but also happens to be finishing her gig as president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, is going to provide some perspective as AAP president, but also talk about artificial intelligence and how that is going to potentially influence what we all do going forward. And I'm looking forward to that, Sandy. And then the afternoon session we'll review over lunchtime, but we, I think, have set up a show with some learning, some data, it'll be a good balance. So I think the rhythm will be good today. Want to thank all of our presenters, and none of this happens without a lot of teamwork making the dream work. So there's a lot of folks on our Pediatric Health Network and Children's National Team who have done a lot of work getting all this together and ready to roll, and thanks to that team. So, look at that, 8:44. Most importantly, this isn't simply about us giving you the latest. This is about recognizing and thanking each and every one of you and your practices for the extraordinary work that you do taking care of our kids in the DMV and taking care of each other and advocating for what's best for all of us. So my personal thanks and our team's thanks to each and every one of you. So I think we're moving on to Chip. Chip Hart has been a regular presenter. He's Director of PCC Pediatric Solutions. He and Paul Evanchier host a monthly webinar, and he's well known to you because he's been a regular presenter here. And we are beginning to sort of switch over presentations, but Chip, come on up here.
I'm going to use this because I'm going to walk around a little bit.
If you want to advance
Yep.
the slides,
There we go. All right, groovy. Thank you.
All right. Groovy indeed.
Good morning, class. You all seem a little tired. I mean, this is the best looking group I speak to in the United States, so I'm glad to be here. I am delighted to be here. This is my 10th time here in a row, believe it or not. And I always do sincerely enjoy coming back here. I'm particularly glad that we reshuffled the speaker order so I don't have to follow Sandy, because that would have been a disaster. I'm going to open up with one of your least favorite subjects, and that is math. Okay, we're going to talk about math. We're going to talk about it really fast, because this is a 2-hour thing. This is not a natural 2-hour class, but I've got 2 or 3 hours worth of content potentially in here that I'm going to give you in 60 minutes or less. This is a talk that was almost completely adapted from a talk that I gave with Dr. Hiro Lavagna at the SOPM Section H last year. It went over really well, especially because Dr. Lavagna was great. So I'd like to thank her. You see her on the slide deck there, and I actually straight up stole some content from Paulie for it, so I want to just give him credit as well. One of the things that we run into, or I run into all the time as a pediatric practice management consultant, or one of the reasons I'm gainfully employed, is because so many of you run your practices using feelings. Like, I feel like this person isn't working hard enough, or I feel like this insurance company is the bad one, or I feel like I should fire this person, or I feel like she's doing okay, or I feel like, I just go on and on. And what we're going to talk about, I just want to introduce like one concept to you. If you take one thing away from my presentation today, and if enough of you don't look at me while I talk, I'm going to come down there and walk around. All right? But I want you to consider the idea of evidence-based practice management. You practice, I assume, evidence-based medicine. That's a big deal. That's really important. You like it when there's a little science involved, right? A little, maybe a blind study or a little scientific method. Well, we have a hypothesis, let's test it, and now we have a result. You do that in medicine all the time. Why do you not apply the same concepts to the way you run your practice? So let me hit the official slide deck. As a disclosure, I forgot to do my CME part. I am definitely employed by EHR company, but I'm not going to talk about anything like that, and I'm certainly not going to discuss any unapproved or investigative use of a product or a device. Except for maybe I'll talk about the clicker, all right? Your 3 learning objectives up here. We're going to illustrate how to turn a word problem into a math problem, just like you did in middle school. Everyone's like, why did they open with this talk? It should have been before lunch. It's because I could have snuck out. But no, we're going to go to do some middle school math. We're going to identify appropriate sources of the data required to make an evidence-based practice management decision, and we're going to construct a plan to collect the data. All right. So this question here, very slightly modified, is straight from the SOPM website, the section on administration and practice management where all the cool kids hang out. And if you're not a SOPM member, you should become one. But here it is. This is a question now. I did in advance boldface some things. You may remember this from 8th grade or freshman year. Okay, so here it says, our 4-doctor 3MP practice has been getting slammed online about our practice being inefficient and having long wait times, as well as visits taking forever in the office, and run-on sentences are a problem for some people. All right, 2 of our pediatricians have been practicing in the community. You've already read this, but one of the doctors notoriously shows up 30 minutes late. 2 of our NPs want to go to 20-minute visits for all sick patients, and they also want more vacation and a raise. Our office manager says we're having a hard time making payroll. And then the question gets boiled down to, should we just go to 20-minute appointments for all sick kids? Do any of these problems sound familiar to people here? So I could spend the next 3 hours dissecting this. There are 6 or 7 things bold-faced up there, and there are actually 1 or 2 others that I didn't, where we could break down each one of these problems and dissect it and approach it analytically to actually think about how to solve some of these problems. And that's exactly what I'm going to do right now. I might have time to do 2 of them. We'll see. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, though, because it is the title of this talk, we're going to talk about the no data versus evidence-based practice management. I'm going to talk about important data sources, and then we're going to dig into the case. So I'm going to talk about some examples of when you're going to use evidence-based practice management. So we're going to do a little bit of compensation modeling. I'm not giving a full compensation model talk, but we have to do that. When the nurses say they want more money and more vacation time, we have to talk about compensation modeling. So the first thing to do is to begin asking yourself questions. Well, how many times a month on SOPM does someone write in and say, what is the starting salary for someone right out of residency in this part of my country, in this part of my state? What are you all paying for a nurse practitioner right now? And that question, I'm going to tell you, is not smart. I'm saying that to people in this room who've probably asked this question in public, because it's the wrong question. The question is not what is the going rate for a nurse practitioner or someone right out of residency. The question is, how much can I afford to pay a nurse practitioner? The circumstances just within this room are so broad that a single answer to that question is very wrong for some people. For some people, then that number would be too high, and for some people, that number would be too low. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask, and we're going to dig into the data. We're going to ask questions about your overhead, your RVUs, and production. When you say, what's the going rate for a nurse practitioner in my state or in my town, you really need to dig into it and say, well, how much revenue do you expect that nurse practitioner to generate? How many visits is she going to do? How much revenue do you generate per visit? And then you can start to answer that question. I'm going to give you an example. But if you ask the question, what's the going rate for a nurse practitioner? The answer is not going to be accurate for you, unless you get lucky. All right, number 2. This was another part of the word jumble that we had a minute ago. Do you really know how many patients each clinician sees daily? What is your demand for different visits? How many visits do you need in a day to break even? How can you ask or answer the question, should we move all of our sick visits to 20 minutes, if you don't actually know what the demand is for your sick visits and what the ratio of those sick visits is to well visits and what those different visit types generate for revenue? What is the actual math impact on moving to 20-minute sick visits? I'm going to walk you through it. And the whole purpose of this is to help you make a better and more informed decision. Or, I say patience, patience. When your doctors say, well, we don't have to worry about our schedule, we don't have to worry about our reviews because we have too much patient demand. It takes 6 months to get in here for a well visit. Well, what is the actual effect of that? How long can your practice go with a huge delay for well visits? How long can your practice go with poor reviews? Do you wake up 6 months later or 2 years later wondering why you're only doing cheap sick visits and all your patients have gone somewhere else because those other practices have a more holistic way of treating the patients, and you find yourself seeing too many patients for too little money and not actually providing the type of care you like to give? That happens routinely. And so I'm giving just examples of asking the second question, or you've probably heard the concept of the 5 whys. When someone comes to you with a problem and they ask you, well, and we're going to do this in a little bit, my nurse practitioners, it takes them too long to see these kids. They don't have enough time to see these kids. You ask why? And very often you will get to a root cause that is so far away from what you are trying to the solution you're offering that you can often make things worse. So, one of the things I want to encourage you is to reconsider where you get your data from. If your input about the change you want to make in your practice comes from a stressed out office manager or a stressed out partner, you're having a partner meeting and a partner comes in and says, we need to make a change to X, this is driving me crazy, or this is what's happening in the practice, and that's the totality of your evidence. Well, we've got to do something about it. This person is really upset. Let's make a change. And I know many of you in here have made changes in your practice just based on someone's strong feelings. How about breaking that problem down into parts and doing a little analysis? And these are the places you should be going to ask. Every one of you in here has a billing system that's capable of exporting data that helps you measure visits, dollars, RVUs, appointments, and not enough of you use that data to make an analysis. You also have your EHR, all right? It's overlooked routinely. People don't know. And I've been in this room and given multiple lectures about pediatric benchmarks. And you don't enough get into your own data to say, well, this is how our office operates, or this is how we've been operating. You often have data that will support it. And I'm going to give you some examples. I'll give you 2 or 3 while we're here. You need to ask your staff, and you need to ask everyone on your staff who is directly involved with the problem or the issue at hand, because your staff often know more about the problem than you do and will have input. Now, of course, sometimes your staff have input that isn't helpful. That's part of your challenge as the owner of the business, to filter out those things. But your staff will routinely give you insight that you can't get yourself because you don't stand at the front desk. You don't talk to the parents about their bills. You don't scheduling the patients. So ask your staff. All right, and last but not least, ask your patients. And in fact, I would suggest that your patients are routinely the most important part of your data gathering process, and it's the one that's overlooked the most. I'm not looking for a show of hands right now, but how many of you routinely survey your patients? If you're not with some routine asking your patients how they felt about the experience in your office, and particularly about very specific experiences, how was that billing experience? How was that experience with that nurse practitioner? How was that experience with me? Did we call you back? Is our portal working for you? Are you getting the information you need as a parent? I'm just making up questions. There are, in fact, what's the name of the questionnaire? It's a really giant long one. I'm sorry, the CAPS? Yes, thank you. I'm going to stand right here in front of Sandy the whole time. She's going to help me out. All right. The CAP survey, which is giant, you can pull questions out of it. You don't even have to come up with them yourself. We'll just have ChatGPT do it. There's, I set you up. All right. There are also one of the other sources on here. I should have actually made some more squares. There are other sources for your data. The people sitting around you, the AAP. I publish tons and tons of data that is free. It's out there. SOPM has data. If you have behaviors that you're trying to change in your practice, start by asking what it looks like as a math problem. All right. So I'm gonna break one down in a minute. And this is where we talk about you need to dig deeper. So when someone comes to me as a consultant and says, this doctor is always 30 minutes late, I always want to actually dig into that a little bit and find out, is it always? Or was it once or twice? Actually, I worked with a practice once, just to give you an example of how you can be misled by feelings. I worked with a practice once, it was 3 partners, and one of the partners had Tourette's. They didn't tell me this until I showed up at the office. And what that meant was he gave the most incredibly thorough well visits you've ever seen, because he would check the ears, check the ears, check the ears, check the ears, check the ears. And they told me this, and they were like, and they said to me, the other 2 partners, it's driving us crazy because he's always an hour behind. And he doesn't see as many patients as we do. So I dug into it a little bit. I said, okay, is he always an hour behind? Well, yeah. And I said, well, how do the patients feel about it? Well, they don't like being late, but once they get in there, they love him because he will focus on them in a way they've never been focused on. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. But I did something really simple. I just ran the data and I counted up his visits. And he was within 5% of their visit volume, which is a number that's so small it can be explained by other things. So I went back to them. I said, I know you feel like he isn't seeing as many patients as you are, but I looked at the math and he is. And that might be his behavior may be causing other problems, but it's not causing a financial problem. You see how like a little misunderstanding of the data can cause other problems. I worked with a practice once in Texas who had a series of managed Medicaid payers, and they had a partner meeting, and they said, you know what, this payer is our worst payer. We hate working with them. They're really nasty on the phone. Let's drop them. And because they hadn't done the math, they dropped actually the one Medicaid payer who was paying them pretty well. And it was their largest. And you know what it's like dealing with managed Medicaid. It took them probably 18 months to rebuild the panel as they were trying to get people to switch, and they backfilled it with lower paying patients because they didn't do the math. I have worked with dozens and dozens of practices who have overpaid partners and employed clinicians because they haven't done the math. All right, and that's what we're going to talk about. All right, so I pulled out this one section of that. Remember that big word problem we started at the beginning? You guys are all so silent. Right now I know what it feels like to be a math teacher in high school. All right. I'm going to pull this one sentence out. They also want more vacation and a raise. Is there anyone in here who has not faced this problem? Okay. So how do you calculate what would have to change to give an employed clinician more vacation, or we're going to look at a raise first, a raise or more vacation or both? And it's actually just a math problem. Now, I'm going to go through this really fast, not simply to obfuscate the fact that we're all tired and we don't want to do math, okay? But it's more that we have a lot to cover. It's in the slide deck. The math is up there. We got some little algebra things. You can always review it later. And you can always write to me and ask me to explain something if I didn't hit it right now. But let's talk about this. The way compensation works is pretty straightforward. There's some subtleties involved, but the math doesn't change whether you're a pediatric practice or you sell flowers or you're an attorney's office or whatever. There's a certain amount of expected revenue that your nurse practitioner generates. You subtract from that revenue the overhead of running your practice. You subtract from that figure the margin for running your practice, and what you have left is what you are able to pay someone. And by pay someone, that's the total compensation package. That's their salary, their benefits, their employer taxes, and so forth. So what I'm going to show you, I don't know if, has anyone here ever read this book by Terry Pratchett, Making Money? Okay, how good is that book? It's awesome. All right, in the book, he tries to explain, it's like a fantasy comedy novel, but it's fantastic. And one of the things he explains is how money works in this town. And the way the money works in this town is there's this giant machine underground that has a bunch of levers and dials on it. And if you turn this lever, something changes over there. And if you turn this dial, that might actually turn another dial. And once you learn how the levers and the dials work, you can actually make the change in this town. Well, we're going to look at the levers and dials, more vacation. We're going to be looking at more vacation, more salary, how many visits, how much revenue per visit, and how you can turn the dials on someone's compensation model in your practice. That's all we're going to do. Okay? So right now, if you already employ your nurse practitioner, you don't have to estimate what her revenue was. You just run a report in your system and say, last year she made $380,000 for us. If you are going to be hiring, this is a small aside, if you're going to be hiring someone, you have to predict how much they're going to bring in. And to predict, you can figure it out but you really have to begin with how many patients a day do you expect that nurse practitioner to see? How many days a week do they work? How many weeks per year? That gets you the total number of visits. Then you estimate how much your revenue per visit is, and then you can figure out this is my expected revenue for this nurse practitioner. Again, if you already have someone, you know what they did last year. But if you're projecting for the future or you're going to hire someone, you have to do a little predictive modeling. Does this make sense so far? This is almost the worst part. So there's my machine. And Dr. Lavagna she shared some real data. This is from her practice. So she had someone who did 20.9 patients a day, 3 days a week, 48 weeks a year, did 3,008 visits, collected $151 a visit for $455,000 of revenue. It's a real number. And that's what she was able to then base the projected revenue on. Now if you remember, it's your revenue minus your expected overhead. All right, well, your expected overhead is your practice expenses, your non-clinician expenses, your revenue generating clinician expenses, and your practice margin. I'm going quickly through this because I'm not doing a compensation model talk, but if the one thing I wanted to cover, is this. When it comes to, and this is a big place where people make mistakes, when it comes to figuring out how much you can pay someone, enough practices don't include their own profit in that calculation. Because in a room full of pediatricians, profit sounds like a dirty word. You don't like talking about the money. I'm going to stand up here and tell you, without profit, your businesses close. And everyone's like, oh, yes, you're right. Here's the thing. You've been profitable. If you've been in business for 10 years, you've been profitable the whole time, or your practice would have closed. You just, as pediatricians, a lot of you like to hide the profit in your salaries, okay? Or pretend it doesn't exist. You must build into your projections a profit, because your profit is what keeps a roof over your heads. It's what allows you to deal with COVID. It's what allows you to deal with a vaccine price change. And it's what you get paid to go in and plunge the toilet on a Sunday, or go to pick up the vaccines because the power went out, or to fire someone and go through that stress. Every night that you've ever spent worried about making payroll, that's what you're getting paid for. And if you didn't have that, why would you go through all that trouble? We'd all just work for the man, all right? I'm at an event sponsored by the man, so forgive me, but if you do not build profit into your calculations, you're either fibbing or you're in danger. And just as a rule, because I'm going to use this in a minute, just use 10%. There's no magic. That's not some special number. It's what I use as a rule of thumb routinely just when I'm doing my estimates. Now, I just talked about that, sorry. So Hero gave us an example, okay? That far column that middle, the first number with the percentages, those were her actual numbers for her practice. She shared that at SOPM. So she generated $1.1 million of revenue. Her practice expenses were $691,000. She paid her clinicians, including herself, as a clinician, $281,000, and she had a practice margin of $140,000. That was what she generated as the owner. Now, knowing this, let's look at what her nurse practitioner, we now made up some numbers, but we want to answer the question, my nurse practitioner wants more money or more time. Well, here are her real numbers. She generated $345,000 of expected revenue, okay? That's 17 visits a day, 144 work days a year, 2,448 visits, at $141 a visit. Hero had 65% of expected overhead. She had a practice margin of $34,000, so she had a total compensation package available to that nurse practitioner of $86,000. That's not her salary. You got to get insurance and benefits, other benefits, and any other expenses related to her, but that's what she could afford to pay that nurse practitioner. So, what if the nurse says, I want to make $100,000? Okay? Because you all have had nurse practitioners who say, well, I want to make $100,000. So let's turn this into a math problem. How could you possibly, in your practice, if one of your nurse practitioners came to you and said, I want to make $100,000, do you have at your fingertips the math to do this? I'm telling you right now, this is a 10-minute task to be able to answer this question, but most of you are like, well, I feel like I can't do that. So this is all you have to do. Okay, you want to make $100,000? $100,000, I'm going to estimate that if I pay you $100,000, the additional overhead cost to me, benefits, taxes, and so forth, it's 20%. I'm making an estimate. It could be 15, it could be 25, but 20% is actually in the wheelhouse. So if I am going to pay you $100,000, I need to be able to get for you $120,000, and here's the crazy math. I got to click right. This is the worst math thing. Oh, I can't shoot it. The worst math thing in the whole concept. If I'm going to effectively pay her $120,000, how much revenue does she have to generate? And look, there's a little algebra question in there. It's 1 minus in parentheses, the overhead remainder plus the margin. $120,000 divided by 1 minus 0.75, it means that she has to go from 17 visits a day to 23.6 visits a day if she wants to make $100,000. It is that easy. So when she comes to you, I need to make $100,000, and you say, awesome, here's my plan. You're going to see 23.6 kids a day instead of 17. Or, I didn't get into this, or you're going to work 4 days a week or 3.5 days a week. Whatever, you now have all the dials of the machine. You know how much revenue she generates per visit? You know how many visits she does? You know how much she wants to make? You are just turning dials until the numbers line up. You could say to her, alternatively, we could increase the revenue per visit that you collect to $196, but that's a hard dial to turn. It's very unlikely that you could do that. Now, let's keep going. What if she wants more vacation? What if she wants more vacation? So I just said, all right, I'm going to give you 3 weeks off. I'm going to give you 3 extra weeks. Now remember, she works 3 days a week, right? So that's 9 days of work additionally she misses. Does this make sense? So all I have to do is at her present volume, if I don't change her salary, but just give her 3 weeks off instead, I do the math down here, and I just redivide, say, okay, instead of working 144 days, you now work 135 days. If you see one more patient a day, I can give you 3 weeks off. You guys see that algebra? What if she wants to do both? You can look her in the eye and say, I can pay you $100,000 a year, and you get 3 more weeks of vacation, but you just need to add 8 patients a day. And do you see how this is so much more effective than I can't afford to pay you? Or no, I can't do that, and because you're basically saying, I feel like I can't pay that. You can just lay it out and you can do your math, and you are having this conversation from a point of academic and factual strength, as opposed to, I just don't make enough money to pay you what you want to get paid. Let me give you another example. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the part we stole from Paul. We took something that Paul did and we added to it a little bit. There is a compensation calculator we put online. So for this particular problem, if you want to find out like how many days a week does someone need to work, or how many patients do they need to see in order to reach a salary, there's a calculator online right there that you can grab and fill in. All right. Here's another math problem. You may remember this one. Remember when they said the nurse practitioners want to move all the sick visits to 20 minutes? Right? Do I have to go all the way back to the beginning? The nurses said, we want 20-minute sick visits. It's too busy for us. So, all right, let's zoom into this. So let's ask why. Why do the nurses want 20-minute sick visits? Because the NP is falling behind with seeing patients. Why? Because the patient workups are taking too long. Why? Well, the vitals room is being used, so the nurses have to wait. Why? Because the nurses are not using the second vitals room. Why? Because they have trouble with the stadiometer in that room. That is literally a real scenario. The nurses were complaining that they were always being backed up, and they wanted to lengthen the sick visits. And by asking why gathering data, I think you can see a different solution to this problem. But what happens instead if we do the math, okay? Let's say that there isn't an easy answer. Let's say that you are in fact overwhelmed and the nurse practitioner needs 20 minutes. Instead of saying like, I can just tell intuitively that's not going to work, how about we do the math to figure out why and how that's not going to work? All right, so here's the present schedule configuration. The existing schedule features 20-minute well visits and 10-minute sick visits for all clinicians. This results in 3 to 6 visits per hour, depending on the visit mix. You see that? They do 3 well visits or sick visits, and very likely a combination of the two. Like it's at least 3 visits and at most 6 visits. 6 sick visits. That makes sense so far? All right, 20, 10, and 60 minutes. It's the only way you can divide them up. We're simplifying a little, but there you go. The average payment per visit for the practice is $150. However, well visits are $255 and sick visits are $110. One thing we want to dig into is, does your nurse practitioner generate the same revenue per visit for those visits? If you have a payer who dings you 15% for your nurse practitioners, those numbers may be different. It's also that the nurse practitioner might have a different visit profile. Everything I'm saying here, where I say nurse practitioner, you can just insert the word my other partner. It's the same thing. Like, we have the evidence about what the practice does, but you can, with your system, dig in to find out, well, what is this individual actually doing at those types of visits? All right. And then, of course, over the course of the year, we did some math, and you can see that the nurse practitioners have a 2-to-1 sick to well visit ratio. They do 2 sick visits for every well visit. Well, it's time to do the math. It means that on average, for the nurse practitioner, they do 6, this is like a tongue twister, 6, and 3 wells every 2 hours, okay? So here's what the math looks like. So on the right, we just had on the right here, under the old model, I just gave you or as what we just reviewed. And at the bottom, I can tell you, again, your system can prove this, but look at the bottom line. As a result, the nurse practitioner averages between $660 and $765 per hour in total revenue. Okay, that's the lowest and the most based on the average visit distribution. However, if you move to 20-minute SICs, look what happens. 20-minute sick visits means that the sick volume will be cut in half. This results in 3 visits per hour, regardless of the mix. So now the nurse practitioner can only do 3 visits an hour as opposed to sometimes as many as 6. And when you do that, if they also maintain the 2-to-1 sick to well visit ratio that they have, because your patient demand hasn't changed, that means every hour, on average, they're going to do 2 sicks and 1 well, which means they are going to now generate average between at most and at least $330 to $765 an hour. They average $450 an hour. Moving to 20-minute sick visits would cost you $1,300 a day. I could have shortened this whole thing by saying, hey, you do 15 sick visits. Oh, no, let me do easier math. This nurse practitioner does 12 sick visits a day. If we double the amount of time the sick visits take, she can only do 6. It's pretty straightforward. All right. And what this is showing, though, is it's doing a little bit of math, saying this is going to push some well visits out of the way, this is going to push some sick visits out of the way. I'm going to lose $1,350 a day if I move to 20-minute sick visits. And that's a lot stronger than, all right, a lot stronger than, we can't do that. We can't afford to do that. You're saying to your nurse practitioner, I feel like we can't afford to do that. Well, now you actually have the numbers, and in fact, it gives you the ability, maybe that's not a good example, but the vacation and pay one, you have a solution to the problem. The nurse practitioner, your staff person, may not like the solution, but you now know the parameters of what needs to happen in order for you to fix that problem. All right, let's bump into a couple more. All right, remember the line that says we're having trouble making payroll, okay? We're having trouble making payroll. Well, what happens if you move your nurse practitioner to hourly? Okay, well, so some people, you're not alone, I hear that a lot. Like, no, that's gonna be scary, all right? This is a math problem, all right? And I will suggest to you, everyone in here, for anyone who has an employed clinician, I'm not going to go suggest that you go offer your employed clinicians hourly agreements, but it is good, it's easy, and it's wise to go do the math to figure out what it should be in that case. You should have, when you're running your own business, a sense of how much each clinician is generating on an hourly basis for you when they're fully employed or fully engaged with a schedule. So we walk through right here. What data do we need? We need average hourly revenue, average overhead, and a no-show rate, really. So if our NP from our previous example generates an average of $630 an hour when fully booked, and the overhead is 65% and our margin is 10%, so that leaves 25% left, $158 an hour when the appointments are full. If we subtract 20% for additional benefits and the 8% no-show rate, that means we can afford to pay the nurse practitioner $116 an hour, roughly. And these numbers are made up, okay? Some people are like, I'm not paying my nurse practitioner $116. That's not what I'm suggesting, okay? What I'm suggesting is that's what the practice can afford using these numbers. And you can use your own numbers in these calculations to see how far off you are. And one of the things that I didn't show here is when we come all the way back here, well, we can use that as an example. This one right here, this is, these were based a little bit, I think, on one of Hero's nurse practitioners. You need to, for every one of your clinicians, partner or otherwise, calculate how much you are paying them and what they are generating in revenue for you, and understand, are they actually covering what you are paying them? This is one of the biggest mistakes I see in pediatric practices, and it's a very straightforward math problem. So whether it's hourly or not, I mean, we were doing a math problem for the purpose of solving the problem. It is absolutely possible, and I have had people do this where they're struggling with trying to figure out how to afford a clinician. I've heard this plenty of times from someone who says, oh, I can't afford to hire that nurse practitioner. And I always stop and say, wait a second, if your nurse practitioner is seeing enough patients, what is this I can't afford? You should be making money on every one of your employed clinicians. And you should be making, well, let me restate that. You should be making money, the business should be making money on every clinician in the practice. So when you say I can't afford to hire that pediatrician, the only time that's true is if you don't have enough patients for that nurse practitioner. But if you can fill any employed clinician schedule with 15, 20 patients, there shouldn't be an I can't afford. Does that make sense? And the only way you start to, well, not the only way, but the way you start to see that is by doing this math. Now, excuse me. This is where we also have to call into question or certainly call into play, our critical reasoning skills, okay? The pediatricians are in demand and their time is valuable, although one of them notoriously shows up 30 minutes after their first scheduled appointment. So what I'm going to tell you is that this is where, all right, think about what data do I need to gather to actually address and answer this problem. All right, we're going to want to, I looked at this and said, okay, as a consultant, if I walked into a practice and someone told me this is the data I would be gathering. I'd start with the patient demand and volume. I'd look at active patient counts, the age distribution of patients, and patient surveys and online reviews, because the doctor's assuming that they have enough patient demand is one of the most dangerous feelings there is. I would actually want to go support that and say, do they really have enough demand? Or are they running the practice in such a way that it always feels chaotic and they always feel like they don't have enough resources to provide what the patients are asking for? But if your surveys are down and I look at the patient visit distribution and it looks like they're not getting the newborns they used to get, and the well visit coverage is bad, then I know right now that this practice is about to make a bad decision because they're making it on a false premise that we have enough demand, we don't have to change. All right, what else would I look for? I'd look at scheduling data. I'd look at the real visit volume, appointment depth, how far out are they scheduling, the appointment mix, the payer mix, the waiting times, the starting times. I would be looking at Bright Futures periodicity the schedule and compare that to their actual performance. What do their well visit rates look like, vaccines and screening? I would look at their revenue per visit over time, clinician productivity, practice overhead, and profitability. If I, as a consultant, if someone came to me with this problem, this is the data I would be asking for to start assembling my word problem, my math. To be able to say to someone, well, I've confirmed that this doctor is 30 minutes late every day or not. And once confirmed whether or not, I can say, and this is what that behavior is costing you. Because up until you say, this is what that behavior is costing you, then you're just talking about feelings, and it's very easy to ignore someone else's feelings or make a bad decision based on your own feelings. All right, what else? Oops, sorry, I'm hitting the wrong button. All right. I would ask a bunch of questions, like I say at the bottom, there's more. I would ask a bunch of questions about workflow, all right? Are most patients arriving late? Is the front desk not verifying insurance before the day of service? Is the front desk too busy? Does the EHR make checking in difficult? Were there not enough rooms? Are there not enough nurses? There are so many workflow issues that could be responsible for the back of patients. Is it that you're this doctor doesn't work well with your EHR and this doctor's always behind, or this doctor doesn't have a good nurse, or this all of these things. I mean, if you go down this list, you recognize elements in your practice up here. These, you have to dig into these questions and ask why, until you get to the root of the problem. All right? Now, I was hoping, let me see how I did. I was hoping to end just a little bit early to help also give Jan a little bit more time, because Jan's got some killer coding stuff and I'm doing all right. I'm not quite done yet, but I'm just giving Jan a warning. All right. Here's some changes you might want to consider in your practice. All right. First of all, before your next big business decision, commit to approaching the challenge with an evidence-based practice management perspective. The next thing you're going to do, I'm going to add a practice. I'm going to add a front desk person. We're going to stop doing visits on weekends. We're going to add visits on weekends. I'm going to start using this new procedure code. We're going to give Beyfortus. We're not going to give Beyfortus. We're going to give COVID. We're not going to give COVID vaccines. Sorry. And everything like that. The next time you're going to ask and answer that question, just commit to doing a little bit of evidence-based practice management. Just a little bit. Gather real data from your practice to predict what the outcome of your decisions will be. And this, I really want to underscore. All of you who went to med school, you should understand the scientific method. It is actually, I think, the single greatest human achievement. It's the difference between us and the animals. We experiment, we make a prediction, and we say we're going to try something, and then we look at the results, and then we change our behavior based on those results. That's like monumental. All right? Everyone in here should be a huge fan of Mythbusters, right? Because this is what they do. And a lot of what I do for a living is myth-busting in your practices. So next time you have a problem, you're going to do the first thing. We're going to make a decision based on some data. And then what we're going to do, we're going to all look each other in the eye and say, and our prediction is when we make this decision, this is what we're going to get. Oh, we're going to see patients on Saturdays. I'm making up a simple. We're going to see patients on Saturdays. It's going to cost us this much to cover, but it's going to generate this much more in revenue. It's a very, very simple proposition. I mean, I know practices who've decided to open on Saturdays without even looking at either of those things. So we expect it's going to cost us in staff an extra $1,000 a Saturday, but we're going to generate an extra $2,000 of revenue. And 3 weeks later, 6 months later, go back and check your hypothesis. And I'm not even saying like, oh, and you win if you're exactly right. You won't be exactly right, but you will learn something. Here's, oh, you know what, we didn't think of this. We didn't realize on Saturdays this happens. So the next time you go to make a decision, you are more informed and you have a little bit more data and evidence for the next decision. Or you might say, we're going to open up on Saturdays and Sundays, or we're now only open on Saturdays until noon because we learned something. All right? And last but not least, what I just said, sorry. Review your business decisions after the fact to determine how accurate your prediction was. And just keep rolling. Right now, I just spent 45 minutes saying you don't spend enough time choosing the data to make your decisions, and very few of you spend any time whatsoever reviewing them after the fact. How'd we do? And it's not to score you, but it's to improve your future decisions. It's Hegel's dialectic. It's scientific method, Roger Bacon. All right, that is the end of my talk. I did my best to wake you up a little bit this morning. All right, we have a few extra minutes for Jan. And yes. Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
How many, by show of hands, how many folks in our practice world here make our decisions based on feel? How many? How many use data? How many use both? We do have a couple minutes for Q&A, so if there are any questions, we've got.
All right. If no one has any questions, I mean, I've done this event before, and what happens is you all ask me questions out there because you don't want to ask them in public. That's fine. All right. Or you know what? You can also ask Polly. Polly loves. Oh, there's a question there. Sorry. But you are more than welcome to ask me a question here or later. Please.
Hi,
Yep.
I am Hannah, and I'm with White Oak Pediatrics. And I know one of the levers that you mentioned was increasing the revenue per visit.
Mhm.
We have been attempting to negotiate with insurance carriers, and I feel like I'm getting patted on the head and called cute when I work with them. And I was wondering if you had any actionable tips or people you would recommend for payer contract negotiation, because it would be awesome if we could pay people more without increasing their workload and make more profit.
Yeah, it's weird that during COVID, all the payers set records for profit, and you didn't. You're asking me how do you fight organized crime is really the question you're asking. And if there's a payer person in here, I don't feel bad. At the SOPM section this year, we actually did 3 hours on insurance negotiation. Paul Vancheri and I and Suzanne Madden and Kim Brennan, a practice manager from Florida, did 3 of the 4 presentations were excellent, and I was there too. And it was some of the best content about that specific topic assembled in one place. Unfortunately, it wasn't recorded. And so we are right now arranging for it to be recorded. The slide deck is available, and it's on the SOPM website, and it has a lot of really good content, including links, a description of like how to prepare for an insurance negotiation. Kim Brennan's very, very specific examples of the process she went through. Paul and I had I don't know what the word is, symbiotic presentations where my part fed into his about the data you want to gather. At the end of the day, though, my executive summary is that you can't negotiate with someone you can't say no to. So unless you're willing to walk away from a contract, all you're going to get is what they're willing to give you because they're trying to be nice. The rest of my answer would take 2 hours. So if you ask me, I can get it for you, but if you're a SOPM member on the SOPM website, Mackenzie just uploaded it like a week or 2 ago. The slide deck itself is really, really strong. And we're planning to re-record it and post that video as well. Great, sad question. All right, anyone else? Okay then.
Yeah, that last question was really quite loaded, and being willing to walk is easier said than done. That's probably a whole presentation, maybe for next year. The other thing is getting some leverage, which typically involves either being willing to walk or getting big in some fashion, which is one of the reasons clinically integrated networks sort of happen, like our Pediatric Health Network. But there are, we will talk about this next go-round. For people who are arriving late, there are a couple chairs up front. We'll be bringing a couple more chairs in the back, but thrilled that actually there's such a great turnout. Also thrilled this year that we have Jan Blanchard in person as opposed to virtually. Come on up, Jan. So Jan is a certified professional medical auditor and a coding expert, here to give us sort of the updates about what we need to be planning for 2024, and whatever else you want to ask her. Jan?
Thank you. Yes, thank you all. I think I'm on, but can you all hear me? No. I have a lapel. Okay, there we go. I think we got the volume up. Excellent.
Oh, you have a lavalier.
I do. I'm fancy like that. Yeah, that's what I trust the guys. Good morning. Thank you for having me. I am delighted to be here in person. I was telling Dr. Weissman earlier that I could feel what a great crowd this is, even by Zoom last year. And I made a promise to myself that once Zoom didn't have to be any longer for events like this, that I wouldn't miss an opportunity to appreciate being in person with you all, like being in a room with beating hearts and feeling this energy and really seeing the things that you care about and the things that resonate with you give me a gift of being able to go into depth in the things that you really need to know and the things that are going to help you most. So thank you for being here and thank you for having me. I saw someone walking around with a bag that said grateful, 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 and I just wanted to snap a photo of it. As Dr. Weissman said, I am in the business of watching all the coding stuff for pediatrics, specifically for pediatrics. I've been devoted to you all very intentionally for a couple decades now. And in relationship to Chip's talk, what I'm going to go into is one of those dials. So in hearing the question about revenue per visit, you may be thinking like, oh, the coding part, I'm going to go get a yogurt. Go get the yogurt, but please watch the video after, because what I hope to add to this is information that's going to bolster things like your revenue per visit. I'm going to tell you about codes that can get you paid for things that you don't know are billable. And I'm also going to tell you about some ICDs that may get your claim paid the first time. So if you've got, the golden rule in coding is code to the greatest specificity possible. And when you do that, you have a firmer leg to stand on when you have negotiations like the question that was asked about. When you know what you're saying and when you can tell the payers what the rules really are, as opposed to the way that they're behaving, you have a little bit more leverage and you can speak more confidently, I think. So there is, I was promised a clicker, there's a clicker. Ha! So the necessity of the disclosures. I also work for the Physicians Computer Company with Chip. I've been working with Chip and learning at his elbow for about 20 years now. And I recently started contributing to the AAPC Pediatric Coding Newsletter, and I'm really excited about that. Some disclaimers. Again, I'm not going to be talking anything clinical, so you don't have to worry about me giving you bad advice that way. And getting into our objectives. One of the challenges with a presentation like this is folks inevitably come to me with questions and they say, I know I'm billing this properly. Why am I not getting paid for it? And that is a billing question. So I make the distinction between billing questions and coding questions. I can help you with the theory. I can take the AMA's rules and the WHO's rules and help you apply them to your encounters, where your billers interpret those or put guidelines and roadblocks, as I call them, in between you and the payment you so richly deserve. Those are much better questions for your billers. So they are the folks that are embedded in your practice, doing your billing day to day. They know your payers, they know your Medicaid rules, they know the regional requirements. They're going to be much better able than I to explain why your payers they may be able to explain why your payers are behaving as they do. I don't have a snowball's chance, other than the really big ones. We get a lot of feedback about the really big nationwide payers. I might be able to offer some insight into that, but I didn't want to set you up for disappointment. That was this. I'm mixing up my slides. The previous slide would have had me tell you about the effective dates. So for folks that are less familiar with the coding changes when they happen, you should already be using the 2024 ICD codes. So those go into effect October 1st every year. And since COVID, they have been much more actively updating those on April 1st as well. So I can tell you what's in place now, but word to the wise, pay attention around April 1st. There may be additional useful updates to that. So that's a little bit of a change to the schedule in these last few years. The CPT changes that I'll discuss today won't go into effect until January 1st. So this is your opportunity to take some of these tidbits, go to your biller and say, what are our payers going to do with that new code? Make sure your payers know about them, because they're going to do that thing they do every year. It's like, oh, our system's not updated. We can't pay you for that really lucrative add-on. We don't know data. Like our IT department hasn't loaded the new codes yet. Meanwhile, the very second someone is not eligible for payment, they've got that loaded in a heartbeat, and you know you're going to get a rejection for that, or denial, I should say. So that's the lay of the land, I think. As we get into these ICD changes and all the changes in general, I want to set a realistic expectation for this next hour. There are lots and lots of changes, and going into the nuances of each of them such that I can impress upon you why it's in your interest to use them, I'm going to race through some of these slides. What I do when I create this presentation every year, I have to strike a balance between giving you the details, because that's where coding lives, the coding that is deep in the weeds, and giving you the theory and the improvements or the implications of the changes. So I'm going to give you a lot of slides, but I'm not going to linger on some of them. As I race through them, please don't, if something catches your eye and you want me to go back to it, I'm more than happy to do that. And like Chip said, we'll be in the halls too. So if something catches your eye that you want me to go into more depth about, I'm sincerely grateful to do that. But for sake of time, I will kind of race through a handful of them. Some of them are, variations on a theme. You'll see what I mean. So the 2024 ICD guidelines, they had some changes in them, including this. So among them is this change. As this COVID, the Z1152 encounter for screening for COVID code is not a new code, but it was introduced prematurely. It was introduced at a time that it could not be used, or it wasn't recommended to be used, and the payers are very happy to reject claims that it included it, because at the time that it was introduced, the PHE was still in effect. There had not been a declaration to the end of the health emergency. Encounter for screening by its nature is maybe you have it, maybe you don't. And when you're in the middle of a PHE, it's kind of assumed everybody's got it, the nature of pandemic. So this code was not in effect at that time, but it is now that declaration has been made. So freely use Z1152 if you're screening folks for COVID. In chapter 3, diseases of blood and blood-forming organs, I think that's the longest chapter name of all of them, there are a handful of dactylitis codes that have been added and some variations thereon. I'm sorry, not dactylitis, sickle cell. There are a bunch of new sickle cell codes. So if that's a condition that you screen, treat for, encounter, take a look and see, again, code to the greatest specificity possible. This is the nitpicky nitty-gritty I was talking about. So be sure that you know and you're aware of those variations if they'll be useful to you. Gender identity disorders have some new useful additions as well as of October 1st, and some good synonyms. So those things, it's not the identity disorders on this page, it's not those identity disorders themselves that were added, but it's synonyms. So if you've been struggling to know specifically which code applies to these more specific identity disorders, there are variations on transsexualism. There is a new synonym for gender identity disorder of childhood, so these can be helpful in being really, really specific. And this is a continuation thereon. Gender incongruence is another new idea expressed in these synonyms. Chronic migraine got a whole lot of additions made to it, and they are specifically the variations on with and without refractory, with and without aura. If migraine, again, is something that you find yourself treating, be sure that you're choosing the newest, most specific code available for that. Lots of variations on those. Now, there is a new set of codes. The H57.8A code is foreign body sensation in eye, and there are many variations thereon. And one of the, you'll see that there is an R code that references these. I'll get to that, but foreign body sensations in eye and throat had a little bit of an overhaul or some massive additions made. So you've got laterality here, foreign body sensation, left, right, bilateral. J codes, diseases of the respiratory system. You've got additions. These are all new codes. This entire slide is other specified chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And I look at these, this is by no means exhaustive. I should have said at the outset that this is not all of the changes in ICD and CPT. These are the ones that I put a primary pediatric eye to. So this is not 100%. If you've got specialists in your practice or even subspecialists, you may want to look a little bit deeper into these areas. I do a super high level primary care. I put a primary care lens on these, primary care pediatrics in particular. So seeing that chronic asthmatic obstructive bronchitis caught my eye, and I wanted to be sure you knew about these. If you are using M41.12 for adolescent scoliosis, be sure that you're now using it properly, in that they inserted idiopathic into that descriptor. So if you've been using that code for anything other than idiopathic scoliosis, then you want to rethink that. You want to look for a more specific code and not just continue using the same N41.12. And there are some looks around the room that make me think my lack of clinical understanding is making this superfluous. It's like, is there another kind? I'm getting folks going, is that a thing? So you please understand, zero clinical training here. This is me applying coding principles strictly and making sure that you have the benefit of knowing these things exist, not how to use them or who to use them on. I never miss an opportunity to tell folks that in pediatrics, unless you're treating moms, you should not be using codes ever from the chapter that begins with the letter O. That chapter 15 is strictly mom codes. So if you find yourself getting insurance rejections for codes that begin with the letter O, look at who you're treating and make sure that that's who they apply to, because those O codes are strictly for the mom. They do look, I mean, that period of life is so easy to cross over and so easy to conflate that some of the conditions, whether it affects the fetus, whether it originates with the mom or the fetus, that can make choosing those codes really attractive, but don't fall for it. And continuing into, I made a mistake on this slide. This says that this Down syndrome code is new. This says this entire slide is new, and that is not true. I mistyped this. The only things that are different about the Down syndrome codes this year are these are the inline, what they call the coding level guidance, the code level guidance. And it's that code also and the use additional. Those two statements are what's new. So now with Down syndrome, you are encouraged, proper coding says to code any physical conditions such as atrioventricular septal defect. So add that on your claim if it is something that the patient's experiencing. And the use additional code to identify degrees of intellectual disabilities used to include both physical and intellectual. So they kind of extracted the physical recommendation out of the use additional and stuck it into the code also. If there are coders in the room who care about the difference between code also and use additional, happy to get into a conversation with you outside the context where it would glaze everyone's eyes more so than a coding talk typically does. Even more so, I should say. And these are just the variations on that Down syndrome code that the use additional and the code also apply to. Signs and symptoms. So the R09.89, other specified symptoms and signs involving the circulatory and respiratory systems. This is a code I hope that you don't have to use very often for two reasons. Is that other specified symptoms is really nonspecific. It is, if you're seeing something that is absolutely not described by any other ICD, you'd resort to this. These are kind of code of last resort. They're codes of last resort. The other thing is that R09.89 is from a chapter that the payers really like to reject on their face. They like to say, you're coding for a symptom? You couldn't do better than that? What are you treating them for? Did you even manage this problem? They go off on a whole tangent where they feel justified in giving you like low-level claim rejections and making your billers really work for the tiny little bit of payment that they're going to give you for that service in the end. But when there are more specific codes than symptoms, please use those. But when you have no other choice, the R09.89 is available if it's just the symptom they presented with, you didn't find anything to manage. But feeling of foreign body in throat is one of those synonyms that existed in the previous version. Now that there is a whole new set of foreign body feeling in throat codes themselves, you don't have to resort to the other specified. You've got something better to use, and that's these. R09.A is a whole series of codes that you can use for patients who present with a foreign body sensation in their throat. The location is specified, whether the site rather, the site of the sensation. So those are the variations on this R09.AX. I can't say X anymore. X is a thing. It's not a placeholder anymore. So I gotta take that out of my repertoire. Continuing on, there is another symptom code, a new symptom code, other symptoms and signs involving emotional state. And again, it's not the code that's new, but it's those synonyms. So if you've been struggling to find something that properly describes flat affect or properly describes loneliness, which seems to be pervasive in some spaces these days. You now have the WHO's assertion. Yes, this is the R code that matches loneliness and flat affect. External causes of morbidity. These next few slides are going to be ones that I'm going to race through as I warned you about. There is a whole host of new codes that are related to foreign bodies entering into or through a natural orifice. Which specialty do you think they wrote these for? Between noses, ears, and otherwise, you've got so many options now for describing where it went and what it was made of. And those come in these form. You've got batteries. What kind of battery? How big was the battery? Was it a charged battery? No, I'm going a little overboard on that, but you've got batteries. You've got plastic. How many kinds of plastic and what varieties of plastic objects are available to tiny little hands to push into tiny little orifices? We've got beads, we've got coins, we've got toys. You see where we're going. You all are exactly who they created these codes for. So this whole series of W44 codes is yours for the using. We've got glass. We've got magnetic metal. We've got non-magnetic metal. You say, yeah, the slides are, you'll get the slides. I'm sorry if I'm going too quickly to take photos. But the video and the PDF will have these. Bottle caps, can lids. This is not my favorite work to do. When the addendum comes out for this each year, I gird myself. I'm like, okay, which really painful conditions or like uncomfortable sensations am I going to experience while I'm summarizing these for you? But I do it for you. Rubber bands. Oh, keep going. And non-organic objects. Audio devices, earbuds. Oh, I'd never even thought about earbuds before this one. I mean, they're meant to go in your ear. So like the poor kid, that's a confusing message. Sharp objects. Hypodermic needles. Like I said, this is one of the series of slides I'm happy to rush past. Hopefully you won't have to use a lot of these, but they're here if you need them. Let me go back just 1 second, and while this is a sort of a deeper level coding concept, not so much, but it can help you with code selection. The difference between W448, other foreign body, and W449, unspecified foreign body, if I can give you any guidance in choosing between those two, I want to offer that. Other, when in coding terms, and ICD terms in particular, when the word other is included, what's expected is that you documented what you know about this condition, what you know about the foreign body, what you know about the natural orifice, and try as you might, you could not find a code that matches exactly that foreign body and that orifice. What unspecified implies is, excuse me, you did not have all of the information you need to choose a proper code. So other means, yeah, I know everything and I can't find a code for it. Unspecified means I don't know everything I need to know to choose the proper code. All right. So does that distinction make sense? Because it's used a lot. It's used in there's usually like a backdrop code for most any condition. So that distinction between other and unspecified is a good one to master. Encounter for child welfare exam. So there are now, that is a new code, the Z02.84. It's in that administrative encounters section, that Z02. So this is a new variation on that, encounter for screening. And the excludes, there are other codes for encounters for exams and observation for alleged child physical abuse and for alleged child rape. So the excludes are important here. The welfare screening is distinct from alleged abuse. So be sure that what you documented matches what you report on your claims. And continuing in the chapter 21, observation and evaluation of newborn for other specified suspected condition ruled out. So this is one of those perennial problems that a biller has when they're asked to double check a set of ICDs that a clinician chose and the doc ruled out. Our hearts sink when we see that, because for so long there was an absence of ruled out codes in ICD, and it's not even guaranteed in all chapters or for all conditions. So we kind of get a little anxiety, and then a code like this comes out and we go, okay, yes, we can express that ruled out idea. So that's a good addition. Other problems related to social environment, inadequate social support, and lack of emotional support. Again, as circumstances and social conditions morph and change as they do as we humans evolve, hopefully, there are additions to these code sets to accommodate those and express those ideas. Continuing, lots of Chapter 21 changes for us. Child and welfare custody there's just some language changes. So the codes themselves didn't change, but the idea of being in the care of a non-parental family member has changed into guardianship. So there are language changes that distinguish these from other ideas expressed in other chapters. So while in isolation they may not look like really big deals, there are some co-coding gains to improvements like this, but I wanted you to understand the differences in this language. Institutional upbringing, these were modified to, rather than a child living in an orphanage, child living in a group home. So the descriptor of group home is just that little bit broader and can apply to a few more specific situations than orphanage might, describing orphanage would. Or rather, I'm sorry, the distinction in this change is going from orphanage or group home to one, orphanage is one synonym, group home is a different synonym. So somehow that distinction made sense. When you see these changes, they're not material for your use of the code. They didn't change much in your approach or the meaning of the code. Child in new codes again, child in custody of a non-parental relative, more adaptations to accommodate a greater number of specific circumstances. Child in custody of a non-parental relative, and then a variation also for a non-relative guardian. Other specified problems related to upbringing. So the upbringing code itself is not new, but the synonyms are. So again, this is all an attempt at reassuring you that the codes you're choosing match the circumstances you're documenting and encountering. Parent-child conflict, who sees that? Parent-stepchild conflict, that's a new one. Who doesn't want to be able to describe that specifically? So it is the step-parent that's the problem. They're getting short shrift again. I'm joking, these are all not these jokes. Some of these jokes are for me, apparently. But these are variations. Yeah, I could read to you all day long, and having time for Q&A is probably something that I want to keep forward as well. And we haven't even gotten to the CPT changes. There aren't a ton of those, so rest easy. Non-relative, so the variations on here are the relationship between whom the conflict exists. So you should be able, hopefully now, to find one that matches what you're looking for. There is a new code also for non-relative guardian-child conflict and group home staff-child conflict. Runaway is a new code. So when kids take off of their own accord and you're involved in managing that dynamic in care, you've got a code to describe that, Z62.892, and other specified problems related to psychosocial circumstances. Again, this is going to be one of those catch-alls. It exists so that if you don't find a code, another code that is more specific and more appropriate, you've always got this one to rely on. Continuing, caregivers non-compliance. So these non-compliance codes are relatively new, and what's new this year is that new caregiver underdosing with underdosing patients' meds not otherwise specified. So they go into, I feel so validated by the what looks that I get from some folks in the audiences. Are they really getting that specific? They really are getting that specific. So depending on why a patient is non-compliant and at whose direction they are non-compliant and the way that they are non-compliant are things that you want to be documenting if you want to use these codes. So why it is it socioeconomic? Is it lack of understanding? Is their caregiver able to prove understanding of the care plan? You've got a whole host of codes that can help you codify why it is that the patient's not following the care plan that you've set out for them. And those are all here in that Z91 area. And yeah, the reason, financial hardship, whether and how they're non-compliant, and that's all in, all of these codes are created for the purpose of codifying what it is you see and why patients are behaving the way that they are, really getting into the specifics of the circumstances of the care that you give.
in a way that might be reportable to public health agencies that can direct funds toward resolving or relieving some of these causes. So it may seem like a pain in the bum, but if you are in a place where your local government is actively using this information, or even contributing, if the local government is contributing to the greater national data set to direct aid and to direct attention, this is one of the sources of that information. So if that's any encouragement to you to be as picky as I am about this stuff, or better yet, to hire somebody who is as picky as I am about this stuff. ICD guidelines also included a couple changes that are worth knowing about. If you're using underdosing, there were a handful of codes really introduced recently that express the idea of underdosing. Again, much like noncompliance, the reason they're underdosing, how they're underdosing, who's the source of the underdosing, the guidance is now very explicit to say that Z91.A4 has joined the list of codes that should not be assigned as a first listed code. So none of these Z codes should ever be the first code listed on your claim. If you're getting rejections from your payers for that reason, the payer is right. So knowing that you have to have something more concrete, something more, the underdosing isn't the reason that they're there. You would want to express in a code the effect of the underdosing, or something more tangible, something that you observed personally, not this circumstance. Still with chapter 21, more caregiver noncompliance, specifically to renal dialysis. And then if it's neither medication nor renal dialysis, if it's none of the conditions that are mentioned in this subsection of ICDs, you've got that catch-all caregivers noncompliance with patients' other medical treatment and regimen. Other specified personal risk factors not elsewhere classified has a new synonym, and that is increased risk for social isolation. Again, not a new code, just more reassurance that if you're seeing patients experiencing this, you've got the WHO telling you this is the code to use in that case. And this new chapter that came about during COVID is getting continued attention. There is a new code, or new use additional guidance. Again, that difference, this is one of the geekier coding concepts, new use additional, but if you're gonna share this information with your coders, they'll know. Use additional code if applicable for associated conditions, and then they list the conditions that you should be listing in addition to COVID if they are experiencing those, and those codes are listed right here on the screen for you. And in the manual. I took these right from the manual. This is not the source of those things. You all have manuals that should be up to date and include these as well. So, with just a few minutes, well, no, I guess, oh, thanks, Chip. Yeah, you did. Chip did give me a whole lot of good time. So CPT 24 will move from ICD into CPT. Now, again, these don't go into effect until January 1st. So everything that I've covered so far, you should already be using, or you can use now. And CPT, what goes on from here is January 1st or after. The first thing that I go through when I do this analysis is the guidelines. So I look at that whole section at the beginning of the CPT manual that you hopefully have never cared about, and you've got somebody doing this with or for you. But looking for the updates and changes to that is what I'll go through first. The 2021 changes to the E&M approach of using just medical decision-making or revised time definitions is what this slide relates to. Whereas there was a range last year, or currently, you have a range of minutes that you can use to choose the E&M code that you select for a given encounter. That changes to must meet or exceed. It seems like a little change, and in some ways the range is implied, if you're above one and not quite at the next. What it does do effectively, looking at the ranges, you would assume that. What it does effectively is it obliterates any hope of what we call the midpoint rule. Does anybody know what the midpoint rule was? Handful of folks. When you have a range, unless otherwise specified, unless it's stated otherwise in the manual, AMA agrees that the midpoint rule says that once you exceed the difference, so if there was a range of 15 to 25 minutes, once you get past halfway between 15 and 25 minutes, you can build a code that is higher than the 15 to 25 minute code. that midpoint rule let you round up. That's no longer available for E&M services. I'm of two minds about this. I think that the time definition as it changed in 2021 is so much more accessible, and the activities that you can include in your time total for E&M selection is so much greater and understood to be so much more accurate to the way that you do medicine in a given 24-hour period. That's the constraint that they're leaving on you. Then I don't feel like this has the same effect it would have before the 2021 changes. So this really feels like a sort of a grammatic change more than anything, but that if you see that, that's all that it means, if you're curious about that change. And these are the new time totals that have been added for 2024. So be sure that if you are a fan of using time as your E&M selector, that your times meet or exceed these minimum thresholds for the codes that you're choosing for that encounter that day. There is an effective change to audio and video and audio only leveling or selection criteria. So when I read, let me tell you what it says and then I'll tell you what my interpretation of it is. So there are appendices at the back of the CPT manual that tell you which codes can be, or which services may be billed as audio video services or audio only services. So P&T respectively identify those services that can be rendered or it can be conducted audio video and or audio only. What this change means, let me read the change. I said I was going to do it and then I tried to skip right past it. So all of those codes must meet the criteria that the totality and quality of the communication of information exchanged between the clinician and the patient during synchronous telemedicine must be of an amount and a nature that would be sufficient to meet requirements for the same service as if it were done in person. And, whoops, I'm using the wrong button. And that evidence supports the benefits of performing that service through telecommunication. And they list a handful of examples, included but not limited to, these must be the benefits of performing the service in the way that you chose to do so. All right. So they're kind of saying not everything should be done by telemedicine. Now they're like looking to put some constraints and some guardrails around that. The way that I see this though is the loophole. I look for loopholes for you all. I would not be at all concerned with a clinician using that final bullet point, enhances access to patient care, enhances access to care for services that you deem reasonable to do via telemedicine. And the example that I have in mind when I feel that confidence is you all have patients who don't want to drag their newborn out to have their 4-year-old evaluated for an ear infection. You don't want to have them sitting in a sick waiting room. The convenience of that, if that's going to mean the difference between them seeing you via telemedicine or going to a closer urgent care clinic, that is access to care. That's access to quality care. And I am a strong enough proponent of, I have a strong enough understanding of the massive value you add over those convenient services to say, yeah, that's an enhancement to access to care. I think that putting barriers to care between patients and pediatricians is unconscionable, and this is my own little social experiment to say, I empower you to use that final bullet point to keep doing what I know you all are doing, and rendering that exemplary care by telemedicine. The experience that you have, you've seen enough of these cases, you know your patients well enough that this is while we have to pay attention, I don't think that this constraint is super material for you all. I don't see the audits that I do don't turn up a whole lot of clinicians just casting off a Zoom recording and billing a 215 for it. It's just not something I see pediatricians doing. So for this audience, I feel comfortable offering you that interpretation of this. The other things you can take into account if these other bullet points are in place, you're bulletproof. So if Zoom facilitates, or telemedicine rather, facilitates diagnosis or treatment, if it helps them maintain the care plan, it's your discretion that could be used. What I will say is document that. Be sure that you're not just using this to soothe yourself. If these are the things that are offered by AMA, be sure that you document those things so that when a payer comes back and says, wait a second, your telemedicine visits went up by like 15% this year, we're going to audit you. We reserve the right to audit you. Make sure that you're at least a fair number, if not all, ideally all, of your encounters include a nod to why telemedicine was a better choice. And of course, there are changes to the COVID codes, and those include these. So now they are published. You may already be using some of these. These are the published vendor-specific COVID vaccine supply codes. There is also, when you get the PDF of these slides, that blue link is an online PDF version of these, so if it's something you want to just quickly print off and hand to your biller to make sure that these are being used as you expect, that is a handy resource there. And there has been lots of talk about and a good amount of information circulating about the way that split or shared visits must be coded and the coding rules around that. Are there folks in here that are doing shared and split visits? Handful, just a couple? Okay. Be sure that you take a good look at this, because the time spent by each participant, by each clinician participant in these codes is paramount here. It is a consideration, I shouldn't say it's paramount. And there are specifications. They're getting more and more prescriptive and clearer about what services qualify to be defined as split or shared. So if in fact, I didn't see a lot of hands, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this, but these are the recommendations, and these are the specifications that have been added to CPT for 2024 for those services. There is a new add-on code for pelvic exam. So while this, in my years long ago in adult medicine, there was a perennial warning that unless you were a Medicare practice, unless you were billing for a Medicare patient, there was a Q code that you could bill for a pelvic exam, an add-on to an E&M, that could only be used in those circumstances. It was only if you were a Medicare patient and that it was a Q code, Medicare was the only payer that was paying it at the time. That's made its way through the works, and there is now an add-on code 99459 that expresses the additional work of doing a pelvic exam in addition to an E&M. Not just an E&M, but also well visits. So if you're doing GYN services or GYN exam, pelvic exam for either sick care or care maintenance, then give this a shot. It has an RVU. It's been in existence for a bit, but in 2024 is the first year where it has RVU value. So that is sort of hinting toward the idea that these will be payable by payers other than Medicare. The caveat is the RVUs were, oh, Chip's not in the room. The RVUs were just released yesterday, the RVU values for 2024 as part of the final rule, and I haven't looked to see. The suspicion was that it was only going to have a physician work RVU. There's Chip. I love when he makes that face, like I caught him doing something. Oh, yeah, no, pelvic exams don't make me think of Chip. I appreciate that clarity. No, it's an RVU question. So, and we were laughing among ourselves yesterday, like, we're out here and we should be at our desks with the RVU files. We should be poring over this. But it remains to be seen. I will look just as soon as I'm able to see if it is true that it was just the work RVU that is assigned or valued for this pelvic exam. But do check in with your payers, see if this is a code, or make sure, like, give them the hint. Say, hey, we got a couple weeks left for you to load data into your systems in order for you to cover this code. It is a useful, valuable service that you render, if you render it, and give it a try. You can, and as I said, it's written right into AMA that it is billable with sick E&Ms as well as well care. So give it a shot. I'm gonna go on is that a question? The question is, do we know if it needs a modifier yet? Ready for my modifier rant? I'm a coder, did I mention? Modifiers are they're necessary so much less often than the payers make you use them. So I look at 99459 and I look at 99213, I see the difference between those two services. The payers then say, oh, put a 59 on that add-on code so that I know they're different codes. And my eye starts twitching because they are different codes. And they'll do that. They absolutely throw roadblocks. That is a way that they will delay payment for you and hope that you, A, don't notice, B, don't have the time to argue with them, and C, maybe don't even know. So this is me telling you, there is not a coding purpose. That's a great question. There is not a coding purpose to have a modifier on two codes that have very distinct differences that aren't even the same code. If I were billing a 99459 and a 99459, sure, I could see putting a modifier on there. I wouldn't expect you do 2 pelvic exams on a given day, but what do I know? Like I said, no clinical training, that might be a thing. I hope not. And so the necessity is not coding. If there is a necessity for it, your payers will be the ones to tell you which is required. My guess is they're going to be 25 or 59 because those are the 2 most abused modifiers on earth. Okay, in the US. Going global here. I'm like getting ahead of myself. Global. Coding for all. So that is the last of the specific code changes. The other bits that I'll get into, I affectionately titled bits and bobs. So these are things that are related to codes, but more about they're more conceptual. I don't know why I put the emphasis on that syllable. Within E&M consideration, there has been, ever since 2021, and probably earlier, it's the 2021 changes brought these to light, that there are, the concept of risk is one that can be applied in a variety of places. And the reason that this difference is important this year, or highlighting this is important, is because the way that you think about risk when you're choosing your E&M level is very specific, has a very specific definition in that context. So I want to be sure that folks understand the difference between those so that you're not adversely affecting your visit level or choosing differently than is intended. So there are two contexts of risk, and one is the risk of complications and or morbidity or mortality of patient management, and the other risk is the risk to the patient from the condition that you've identified and you're managing. So one is your treatment plan poses risk to the patient, the other is the condition you find them in poses risk to the patient. And only one of those may be used as one of the 2 out of 3 elements that you consider when you're leveling based on medical decision making. And the one that is used as one of the 2 of 3 is the risk that your plan poses. So any additional diagnostics or treatment. That's the one that you should be using in that third. I'm looking at them. I have the grid in my mind, so I'm going left to right. That risk column is about the risk of your treatment plan. The other risk has an effect, but it is distinct from that. The other risk, the risk of the condition, can factor into that first column to describe the risk, the severity level of the problem. So you know when you're looking at the number and complexity of problems, that's where the risk of the problem itself can inform your decision. So if this is a super high risk problem, that's going to increase the complexity of the problem selection. Is this making sense to anybody but me? Does that distinction make sense? I can absolutely share a tool that makes that even clearer if folks want to. I have the easiest email on earth, even easier than Chip's. There's one less letter. And the final thing that I will tell you about is something that I'm very excited about because, again, it feels like an opportunity. This G2211 is an add-on code that I think also just now has RVU value this year. I can't wait to dig into those files. Can you tell? I'm itching to get back to my keyboard. Visit complexity inherent to E&M associated with medical services that serve as the continuing focal point for all needed healthcare services and or with medical care services that are part of ongoing care related to a patient's single serious condition or a complex condition. So this is an add-on that basically says, this is a complex case. When you perceive that you're working with a patient that is a complex case and that you're going to be managing more, you're doing more for that patient due to the complexity of the care needed to manage them safely and well, G22.1, not point, I'm back in ICD land. This is a CPT, this is a HCPCS. G2211 is an option for you to explore with your payers, and again, to build this and see what they do with it. They may already have it loaded in their system. It's not a brand new code, but again, I think this is, I'm fairly certain this is the first year that this has RVU value and may actually pay something, especially if you've got RVU-based contracts. This is a list of resources that I used to ponder and create this content for you, and that is everything that I have to offer. Can I clarify anything or answer any questions? We have a question. Oh, yeah.
We'll bring the mics to you, just raise your hand.
So raise your hand if you have a question, and a mic will come. A mic will be on the way, and please do introduce yourself.
Mike Levitas, Cumberland, Maryland, Children's Medical Group. The code you reviewed for condition ruled out, some of my colleagues like to use for a diagnosis where we ruled out something, worried well, which I don't like. It's kind of judgmental. Would you consider that code, the new code, a good thing to use when a parent comes in worried about a particular diagnosis and we have a totally normal physical exam?
That's a great question. No, I would not. I see a distinction between worried well and ruled out. So ruled out says to me that you suspected a condition, you took action and you proved that it's not there, or you entered it into your thinking, and in your conclusion, you do not believe it to be so. Worried well says that, I mean, unless you took action to prove that there was no concern, I would stay away from ruled out. Worried well, as judgmental as it might sound, conveys, it codifies. That is that's part of the parlance, and I think the parlance is the problem, not the code. But the code where there was concern, where none was necessary, you didn't find any evidence. You didn't take action because you didn't see any evidence needing to rule something out. You simply didn't see evidence of what the concern was. So I think that fine distinction, while annoying to people who don't love codes like I do, I think is material in that case. Thank you.
Hi, Rona Stein, Valley Pediatrics in Owings Mills. I have a question about the whole risk thing, which of course is really complicated. So as an example, if you have a 3-week-old with bronchiolitis, that's going to be a lot higher risky condition than bronchiolitis in a 3-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
So which of those risks things would be increased?
Great question. In the notes that I look at, they generally correlate. So I may be making more of the difference in the risks. Again, I'm the like detail chick. I said chick. I am the detail professional. Then it may be immaterial depending. They are relative, but don't depend on documenting the problem to support the risk of your care plan, your treatment. Did I understand your question properly?
Sorry, just trying to figure out, I mean, is the condition is risky, or, I mean, I guess it's not really the treatment is risky, but the risk of morbidity in the child is much higher. So it increased the risk, I guess, of the condition, and that would affect the coding that way?
Yes, so if the condition itself is high risk for the patient, you're gonna get a higher complexity and number of problems score, for lack of a better descriptor. Your score is going to be higher in the complexity and conditions, and depending on your care plan. I mean, if it could be a high-risk problem that you then refer to a specialist, so your care plan is going to be referral, and you're not taking on any of that risk. So that referring to a specialist doesn't raise the risk of your encounter or your care plan, but they're still a high-risk problem. So they can correlate, but aren't necessarily equal in E&M terms, in medical decision-making terms. Yeah, thank you. Other questions?
Mohab Andraus from Alexandria, Van Dorn Pediatrics. So before COVID, I'm here.
Oh, thank you.
Before COVID, for the audio, for the phone calls, it used to be that it shouldn't result in a visit within 24 hours, if I remember correctly. I don't know if this is still the same situation now with the audio and visual code visits, because very often you need to bring them again next day for testing, and or what is your opinion, like how to deal with this best, like to code it as a second visit and the second day when they come for testing, or to just code for testing? This is one question. Second question, many insurances require that you change the location of service code for audio and I know for video, but does it apply on audio also?
Great questions. So for your first point, I'll say back the question to be sure I got it right, is that you're asking if the patient reaches out and you do a telephone call or you render a service and then they return to the office or they present in the office within 7 days, is that rule still in effect? That was the way that it was in COVID. And yes, that rule is still in effect. I would add to that they would have to come to the office within those 7 days or within 24 hours, the first available appointment, or within 7 days, depending on what telemedicine code you're using. They would have to come in for the same problem. So don't fall into the trap of they called about an ear infection, they came in 2 days later for a laceration. You can bill both in that case. It's two different problems. So don't fall into that trap. But yes, those rules are still in effect. Those time limits for audiovisual as well as audio-only codes are still in effect. The second part of your question was insurance payers. I've lost it.
Sorry, so if someone comes for a sore throat, like video visit for a sore throat, and they come next day, you can't code again for a second visit next
No,
day?
if both services are, if both the telemedicine service and the in-person service are for the same problem, within 2 days or 7 days, depending on the code, then no, you cannot bill them both. You would bill one or the other. And in my opinion, bill the one that gets you paid more, which I expect is the E&M, the face-to-face visit. Thank you so much.
And the location of service?
Oh, location, yes, thank you. The location, yes, the payers are particular about understanding exactly where you rendered the service. So in-person is going to be the place of service 11, and the distinction between the telemedicine services is important. One of them, 02 and 10 are the two telemedicine places of service. Knowing for sure which one is in the patient's home, the other is in an institution. That is used, or not in the patient's home. It doesn't explicitly say in an institution, but it says one is in the patient's home, the other's not in the patient's home. The implication with the not in the patient's home is that they are in a care facility. So that is much more intended, or is intended, for you facilitating care, like maybe they're in your office and you set them up with a telemedicine service for a very remote specialist. Or they're being seen, they're having an MRI and immediately the hospital staff helps them connect to another clinician elsewhere that can have a telemedicine visit from other than the patient's home. So they're in a care facility somewhere. All right, is there time for more?
Otherwise, we're also heading into a break, and Jan will be available.
I'm tall, you'll find me.
All right, a quick question. So I'm Stephen Hirsch, a pediatrician in Rockville. So as far as the Z codes for COVID testing, like way back when there was lots of COVID, we would do the encounter for screening for exposure. But now if a child comes in and they're sick, they have a fever, and we do a COVID test, is there any reason to do an additional encounter for exposure, or should we just be using the coding for the regular sick visit? And we attach the test, the COVID test, just to the ICD for fever or viral illness and stuff.
Yeah, you read my mind, because when you say the regular visit for COVID, much like strep, you're gonna link the pharyngitis to the strep test, and you're gonna link the strep positive to the E&M, because you can code what you know when you know it. So the reason you did the strep test was because of the pharyngitis. You didn't yet know at the time you did the test. Is that the nature of the question? Okay.
And so then would we link the COVID test to sore throat or fever?
Yes, yeah, I would
Right.
more
and not
do
a
that
separate
for this.
test, yeah.
Yeah, the
And not a
Z code
separate
is
ICD.
the Z code is much more for encounters that were specifically for they came in because we're screening them for COVID, not because they had a sore throat, not because they were symptomatic.
Right, screening without any symptoms, right?
Exactly, yeah. Thank you for clarifying that.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.